to rope me into presenting to you guys. So if you love the presentation, totally give him the credit. If you don't, then I leave it to your discretion as to who to give credit to. So I've worked in cyber for an embarrassingly long time. I started back when DOS 3.31 and Windows 3.0, before the multimedia extensions were added, were a thing. I've worked on defending enterprise networks. I've built tools to mitigate attacks. I've designed and made forensic as well as anti-forensic tools. I've developed capabilities for information gathering and other more exciting operations. Today, I work in training, development, and testing for and environment building for employment on offensive, defensive, and enterprise network operations. Full disclosure, we are not going to talk about the 62 layers of a PCB, but I am always happy to talk about 7-layer burritos or the OSI model and the layers thereof. So let's see if I can get PowerPoint to do its thing. So we do have some ground rules, and first up, this that we're going to have here is a conversation. My expectation is that we're not going to. I don't enjoy listening to people drone on, and my intent is not to drone on for you guys. So if we can figure out a way to make it so that way you guys don't have to suffer through stuff like that, that's so much the better. So that said, what I want you guys to do is I want you to violate convention and interrupt whenever. You got questions, you got something to say, you disagree wholeheartedly, pipe up. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat, but that only works so many different ways. So just hop on the voice, let's have a chat. So like I said, please feel free to disagree because this is a conversation. I'm not the world's authority on this. One would argue Kevin Mitnick would be that guy because at the end of the day, this is all social engineering. But I've played in this arena for a little while, and so I'm happy to share what I know, and I want to know what you guys have to offer as well, because like I said, I don't know all the things about it. If anyone here can find me a legitimate cyber expert, I'd love to meet them. Because we all know pieces and parts. I don't think anybody knows all the things. So that said, what questions, comments, complaints does anybody have? All right, moving on. So any good slideshow, I'm told, requires an overview, and this one has cute icons, so that makes the overview great. Now that we've checked the block, moving on. First up, let's talk about definitions. And yes, having an opinion on all the things, that absolutely counts. So if you've got an opinion about this, please feel free to shout. First up, experts do disagree as to what the exact definition of phishing is. So as one does, we asked Google. The fraudulent practice of sending emails purporting to be from reputable companies in order to induce individuals to reveal personal information such as passwords and credit card numbers. Yeah, that covers a piece of it. It doesn't really cover the full extent of it because you can do so much more with it, or so much more can be done to you depending on your perspective. So really the upshot here is that phishing is one of the most effective methods of gaining initial access into a system, into a network. And if we were to take all of the things that have been written about phishing and its offshoots, I think we can summarize it in 4 words. Phishing is pretty awesome. Depending on, regardless of which side you're looking at it from, whether you're defending against it or whether you're using it to your advantage, it's pretty powerful still. So, by the numbers. First up, if you do a Google search for phishing and file type for PowerPoint, you get 5,500-ish of them. That's actually a lot of PowerPoint presentations. If you change the file type to PDF, you get a whole lot more. My suspicion, without clicking on those links, because I do not want to click on those links, is that a good number of those PDFs are probably infected with something. So maybe you shouldn't do that. It's kind of like doing a Google image search for big pipe. You just don't do that. Next, if you just Google for phishing by itself, you get 48 million hits. That's pretty good, right? These things by themselves don't tell you a whole lot. It just says that it's out there. But when you learn that over 80% of cyber attacks today involve phishing in some way, shape, or form, that tells you that the weak link, the thing that's working, or the thing that's broken, depending on your perspective, is not in cyberspace, it's in meat space. It's the people. The people are the weak link. So how do we use that to our advantage, either on defense or offense? One other fun number here, just for you guys. In case you were wondering, 0%, that is the number of legitimate emails from Nigerian princes that are seeking your assistance in getting finances out of their country, just so you know. And I did not try and build this presentation with the intent of saying, hey, let's look at it from the offensive or defensive or whatever else side. It's supposed to be direction agnostic. So let's talk about motivation, because there's a lot of it here. First, are you tasked with defending a network? Phishing probably matters to you. Are you tasked with assessing network defenses? Phishing probably matters to you. And you go, but wait, there's a space for a third thing. What's the third thing? Are you self-tasked to assess a network's defenses? If so, probably don't want to let MI5 know about it. So anyway, I'll pause there. Questions, comments, complaints, opinions? Oh, absolutely. Because the red team's job is to pretend to be the bad guys, to employ their tactics, their techniques, their procedures, do all the things that the bad guys would actually do. So if your adversary demonstrates a willingness to ignore certain rules or conventions, then emulate that. If your adversary has demonstrated that they will not do certain other things, then don't do those things. But phishing is absolutely part of the toolkit for virtually every red team that I've seen, and I've been involved with at least 3. Phishing your own folks, doing it from a defensively phishing, doing your own red teaming stuff can be highly, highly effective. The key is to make sure that you keep it within the bounds of good order and discipline, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is this. There was, let me see if I can Google this for you real fast. There was an incident, there we go, a couple of years back, while I wait for the interwebs, there we go. I'll paste it into the everybody chat. Back in 2010, the United States Air Force had a kind of a self-phishing thing going on out at Guam. And what they would do is they work really hard to make it so that you could phish from inside the network, but if there was a spillage, if the COVID that they made it outside of the lab, then it would kill itself off. Like any good implant, you make sure that it only works inside of the target area, lest you get found out. Anyway, the article that I pasted basically says that they did not do that like they should have. And because it got out, they went phishing with the offer of being part of a Transformers movie. And so the point of it is that in that case, they're not using it effectively because they let it get out of the bag. Since we're talking about PCV, they let out the gray smoke, figuratively. So in this case, previous to this incident, it looks like the people doing the phishing in Guam were doing it effectively. And here's what they were doing differently than some other people do. They had the backing of leadership, and the leadership was willing to allow these folks to go and basically do public shaming. So from talking with people that were actually out there when this was running, they were like, yeah, so what would happen is they would go phishing and they would catch people. And then every week there was a 1-star that ran the space, and they would every week on the staff meeting, I'm told, they would put the names up, like legitimately the name of the individual that clicked on the thing. It's like playing Cluedo, right? It's Colonel Mustard with the wrench in the conservatory. They would go in and say, it was this person on this PC in this unit. And the 1-star would look at his OF5s and be like, and then the OF5 would like not make eye contact and say, we'll fix it, sir. And it was stunningly effective because apparently this is right around the time when digital signatures on emails were really becoming a thing. And so let's say that we were part of some like NCO core there. What would happen is the lead NCO would say, hey, okay, I'm going to email out this agenda or whatever else to you guys. And so everyone was expecting it. It came from the right person and it came at the right time. So it met all the criteria for something that looks legitimate. If it wasn't digitally signed, every single person there would ignore it. No one would open it. They'd be like, why didn't you open my email? It wasn't digitally signed. And so there was paranoia there because no one wants to get publicly shamed, because it would be from Sergeant Snuffy all the way up to the 1-star. Everybody would know your name, and for all the wrong reasons. Long story short, I think that phishing still has a place, especially on the defensive side, as long as you can convince leadership that it is a thing that the bad guys are going to do, and it's better if you do it to yourself than if you let them do it to you and be surprised by it. And Colin, you might be waiting a little bit longer for that refund. All right, other questions? Good question. Did that actually answer your question, or was it just a lot of words? Well, here's the thing. When you try and make anything, especially IT, when you try and make it idiot-proof, turns out they just build a better idiot. We've all worked in facilities where, or in areas where there's like a fence around the parking area, and you have to go through a certain way to get to work, right? Or into wherever you're going. It'd be so much easier if someone just cut a hole in the fence and you could just walk right through, right? Well, we all know that when people click on phishing things or bring USB drives or whatever else into the workplace or into a place where they shouldn't be, it's the functional equivalent of cutting a hole in that chain link fence. And so I don't know that there's ever going to be a foolproof mechanism. Just like it's kind of like asking, are we ever going to have code that is completely bulletproof and exploit resistant? And I think the answer is probably not. It depends largely on it. The fact that 80% of cyber attacks involve phishing mean that there's some level of human interaction that is failing us. And until we can inoculate the entire population against it, not to make too much of a COVID reference, until we can inoculate the entire population, I don't think that we're going to be able to overcome this phishing thing, because people have been conning other people for since the beginning of time. So I don't know that humans are going to change that much that fast. Well, you know what? That leads actually into our next slide very beautifully. I couldn't have paid you to do better. As it turns out, most effective actions are part of a multifaceted effort. It's not just a one thing sort of approach, because if you take only one system, one approach, you're only going to be able to do it one way. And that makes it very difficult for you to be effective when something else comes at you. It's like having armor on one side of your tank. It's great when shells hit that side, but what about the others? So, like I said, there are all sorts of things, and it's not just phishing. It's pretty much everything in life, better together. If you think like chefs and ingredients, if they use a combination of materials to be able to make what they make. Generals in wars, composers and orchestras, at the end of the day, these are all gems. Phishing very much belongs on this list as well. They're all gems. They are general employers of multifacetedness. Now, I don't know if multifacetedness is actually a word, but it is for the purposes of our discussion. So at the end of the day, gems. So to your question of, do you think it's a human failing? Do we think it's a tech failing? It's all of those, because the tech didn't find it on the way in. The people didn't figure it out on at the time of use, and then the tech didn't detect the odd things happening as the request was going back out, or as the malicious code was doing its business. Does that make sense? About defense first. If you're defending, time to do some math. Let's do that. So first up, you got a baseline. You got to know what normal looks like. And then when you see something that's odd or different, because different is bad, you get an anomaly. When you have anomalies and you correlate them, now you have an event. And then once you have event or events and context, then things are kind of sus. So whether or not you're actually going to do anything about it, it's up to you, but it should at least raise an eyebrow for you. So let's have a little discussion here. Let's do a scenario-based discussion. Let's pretend that you hear a popping sound, you detect an acrid smell, and there's elevated temperature around you. What is this? What do you guys think? Body functions, says Colin, who would say it if his mic was working, but would rather type it. I'm joking with you, Colin. I'm just messing with you. Or maybe it's a day at the shooting range. Or maybe overcooked popcorn. Could be any of those things, right? Maybe it's a raging house fire. You know what? Depending on which thing that happens to be, you might care to a certain, greater or lesser extent, right? If it's a house fire, maybe you should be doing something a little bit more quickly. If it's overcooked popcorn, So when you have, basically here's what we're talking about, right? We talked about sensors, anomalies, correlation, but without that context, who knows what it is? It could be anything. And especially when you're doing stuff on the defensive side, you got to think about, all right, well, what do we have? What do we know? What do we know for sure, right? So let's look at another scenario where we actually have some context. You're at a used car dealership. The salesperson says, oh, it runs great. And then you add it together with, it just passed its MOT last week. You can believe me. And I'm selling it for £1,000 less than Auto Trader or Parker's or whoever. This guy right here, he's telling you all these wonderful things. What do? Anybody trust him? Because I mean, at the end of the day, you've got sensors. The sensors are saying, "Hey, I'm getting good input." Right? Is the input anomalous though? Do I have correlation? Maybe. I've certainly got context. Does that context inform the other bits of information that I think that I'm missing? What is the risk versus reward that I'm facing? And as a defender, realize that your users are doing this, that your sensors are doing this, and that your attackers should be, if they're good, are thinking about this. So how do you break the model for the attackers? How do you make it easier for your users to identify that something is anomalous? Now, certainly software can help, but there are a lot of things to take into account, especially if you have a bit of a more open network where more less work-related stuff is allowed in, and that's considered appropriate for your network. Like if you're working, say, if you're working directly for Her Majesty, chances are most of the email that you'll be getting will be official business, and that's it. If you're working at some like startup, then who's to say you don't spend most of your day on like Facebook or something? So it runs the gamut, and it's up to you guys to decide. I'm not going to come here and say these are the things you absolutely must do. I'm saying here are things to consider, because we're dealing with squishy meat space and we're dealing with people, and so it's going to be messy, it's going to be weird, and it's going to be not entirely mathematically predictable. So I will pause there for questions, comments, and complaints. Going once, going twice, and we shall continue our math check. Remember, when you're dealing with your sensors, be they the senses that you have or the sensors that your device might have, at the end of the day, if you correlating this stuff, you baselining this stuff, presumes that all of your sensors are reporting accurately. So you got to ask yourself, what sensors do you trust, and how do you verify that those sensors are accurate? Well, this goes back to the question that was asked earlier. It's being a gem, multifaceted stuff. Here in the US in the 1980s, President Reagan was famous for saying, trust but verify, trust but verify. And so Some of your angles should include verification of other sensors. For Army soldiers and Marines, usually what they'll do is they'll do overlapping fields of fire. So that instead of one group of soldiers firing in this arc right here, they'll have a second one that overlaps. So that way each can cover the other in case something manages to try and slip through. Similarly, when you're being a gem, when you're employing multifaceted approaches, be it on the offense or defense side, look for ways that you can have your sensors overlap so that one can indicate, hey, this other one is acting strangely. So you can find things that aren't right. Because it's all about first detecting those anomalies. If you can't detect the anomaly, chances are you're not going to find out that something bad happened until it's way, way too late. Or if you're on the offense side, find where those things are overlapping so you can make sure that you're messing with both of them at the same time. So that way they don't report anything weird. All right, pausing. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so what does this have to do with phishing? Well, I think we can all agree no longer can a phishing email come from an open relay SMTP server with gross misspellings and links to random URLs, because the Gemma principles apply here. Even like grandma sitting at her iPad trying to figure out how to open her Gmail, you know what? There's still a little bit of like this doesn't seem quite right that filters through her, and the email providers are getting better at filtering this stuff out as well. It turns out that the tech is actually doing a decent job overall. Intrusion detection, intrusion prevention systems, spam filters, both on clients and servers. They run heuristics on the sender, on the metadata, the content, the links, the attachments, web bugs. They flag a lot of the stuff that comes in. And even once the email has gotten past those filters, then it's got to get past the filters that a person has. So junk like this from Western Union with no space, with horrible misspellings about updating your profile, contact u.s, and then a link to dona.com.au. Yeah, that crap ain't gonna fly. So the natural question that someone would ask is, so what? Well, as we know, the goal of phishing is to get the target to take an action. That action will likely be beneficial to the phisher and not to the target. Really, at the end of the day, so what is not the right question. So how does an attacker do this? Well, there are a couple of steps. And this is really more of a discussion on social engineering than it is on phishing as a whole, because at the end of the day, it's just one implementation of social engineering. And the more, if you're on the defensive side, the more you can inoculate your users to the understanding that there are people out there who want nothing more than to deprive them and your organization of the things that they have. The more that you can convince them that the threat is real, the more cautious they will tend to be, especially if you provide them incentives like public shaming. So how does an attacker do this? First up, you suspend disbelief. They get a target into a state where the blinders go on, and the target only sees what the attacker desires. They will distract. You ever seen a red team assessment where the red team makes a ton of noise over here in this part of the network, and then another smaller team over here goes and does an end run around to do something much more nefarious? So I've totally seen it, and it's a very effective technique. Even in boxing, it's been said, show them what you're not going to give them. Make it look like you're going to hit with this, and then hit them with that. Also, sorry, any other comments from anybody? So how is deception as well? Sometimes it's no more than like an off by one error. But as any C++ coder can tell you, that one becomes a very big number at some point. Getting a target to ignore the right input or believe the wrong input is the goal of all of these things. Attackers can do it in a ton of different ways, but as you'd expect, and you probably come to guess by now, successful ones, the most successful ones, are gems. They use a variety of elements to make the target believe that they're acting in their own best interest, when often the reverse is true. But convincing a target to behave in a wildly improper fashion doesn't always require proportionally large buckets of lies. Sometimes less is more. So let's talk about little tweaks. But first, I'm going to pause for comments, questions, complaints. 3, 2, 1. All right. So turns out that little tweaks can sometimes be the most impactful. For instance, how does this math work? Little drop of water plus a very expensive bomber and then a gigantic fireball. And that's not from a bomb. Their stealth is less effective, but it turns out that the B-2 is an all-weather stealth aircraft, so it can withstand some water. But this is literally less than 10 milliliters of water caused this. So normally it shouldn't be a big deal. Oh, by the way, that bomber, $2.2 billion each. So, like I said, a little bit of water. As this guy said, the right man or bit of water in the wrong place can make all the difference in the world. So, little tweaks. All the difference was made here. So it was in this case as well. A flying wing like the B-2 is unstable, and thus the computers fly it. The pilots give suggestions. For reliability, there are 3 onboard computers on this aircraft, and they vote to determine what to do. On takeoff from Andersen Air Force Base in 2008, a B-2 was on taxi for liftoff and was fully fueled for its flight back to Missouri, which is a very, very long, it's like 36-hour flight. So if you've ever been inside cockpits of aircraft, they're not spacious. Imagine what that place smells like when they get out. It's not great. Anyway, for those who've never been to Andersen, it is normally about 30 degrees Celsius and about 75+% humidity. So it's a bit warm and it's a bit sticky. This particular aircraft was on taxi, took off, and did not get out of ground effect before it crashed and exploded. And yes, to your point, John, stealth aircraft do have sensitive skin, and thus they need to live in air-conditioned hangars until it's time to fly. Going from cold and dry to warm and humid promotes condensation. Again, it's not a big deal, except that a few key sensors on the aircraft developed condensation in the wrong places. This affected their readings, and that gave the computers bad data to vote on. And so that resulted in unsustainable flight and flight orientation, and thus the crash. Fortunately, both pilots were able to eject before the crash happened. If you watch the video on YouTube, you can actually watch, if you slow it down, you can see the left wingtip actually dragging in the dirt before they punched out. So they fought that aircraft to the end. But again, the computers take suggestions, the computers fly it. So 5 minutes with a heater, however, would have saved this aircraft because they could have just evaporated the water inside the little pitot tubes and everything would have been fine. Evaporate the water inside the transducers, everything would have been fine. It was a known issue, but it wasn't done. If the computers had the context the pilots had, or a way to verify the input that they were getting from the sensors, or if they had done the heating prior to taxi, any of these things, or if the manufacturers had installed a heating coil or water detection apparatus, if any of these things had happened, it's the same sort of discussion with the Titanic. If the amount of carbon inside the steel had been slightly higher or lower, if the water had been 3 degrees warmer, if the watertight bulkheads had gone up an extra like 1 deck, if they'd been going 1 knot slower, if they'd been going 1 degree south further, if any of these things had happened, none of this disaster would have occurred. But fact is, it did, and we can learn something from that. The point here is that the computers believed the wrong input, and they had no way of verifying that it was wrong. So you got to make sure if you're on the attacking side, you feed your target a balanced diet of truth and lies. If the target is fed 99.9% truth and 0.1% of well-crafted lies, they're more likely to take that action. So consider, if you're defending, how do you detect this little bit of lies? How do you find that needle in the haystack? Are you assessing the network? What bits of truth can you tweak just enough to bend that piece of reality that's important? For those that want the video, I will save you the search. Yeah, that's the one right there. Now this is from a long time ago, So the video is super low res, but is what it is. So there we are. What bits of truth can you tweak just enough? An email that originally came from Amazon, like you take a legit email from Amazon, taking it and then tweaking it so that it comes from somewhere else. You can pull images, including the web bugs that come from Amazon. The links go to Amazon, and the info that relates to the target in question is all there. But it has one link that goes here. 0.1%. And you say, but hang on a second, you said multifaceted. What the heck? 0.01%? How is that multifaceted? How is that gem? You're lying to me. Multifaceted doesn't mean lies. Lies are just one facet. Creating the perception of a trusted environment, like an email allegedly from Amazon that checks out in pretty much every regard except for that link, especially if it has a clever tooltip when you hover over it that creates the environment the target needs to feel safe to click, instead of doing what they should of copying and pasting the link, inspecting it before going, and then moving on from there. Sometimes tweaking, let me pause there. Questions, comments, complaints? 3, 2, 1. All right. Sometimes tweaking a little bit of the truth won't do. Sometimes attackers need to create an entire universe of fiction, like crazy and clearly false theories. Like, for example, that the Earth is roughly a sphere. Clearly not true. That the moon landing actually happened. Also clearly not true. Or that Welsh rabbit contains neither rabbit nor Welshman. Also clearly not true. I joke. For these triumphs of fabrication, attackers needed a little bit more than 0.1% of falsehood. They changed the size and count of the number of facets on their gem. Depth matters. In instances like these, depth matters. We often talk about defense in depth, boundary sensors, network-based signatures, host-based heuristics, user behavior profiling, identity, identifying anomalous behavior, all that stuff. Why do we limit our thinking to defense in depth? Just defense. You can do offense in depth. For example, when the Central Intelligence Agency or other intelligence organizations like the SIS want an agent to have a believable history, known as a legend, they backstop their agent. They create documents, contracts, contacts, family members, evidence, both online and not, that make it look like the story the agent is telling to somebody else is true. Boyfriend or girlfriend from high school, first employer, ex-spouse, estranged kids, all totally fair game. And they're all forgeable. Phone numbers, driving licenses, bank accounts, birth certificates, medical history, past due bills, traffic tickets, essentially all the metadata of life. The more complete the backstop, the more convincing the agent can be. Turns out that con artists do the same thing. One of the most successful one, Peter Foster, from Australia, created an entire fake company around a product called SensaSlim. This was a diet spray that you're supposed to spray in your tongue before eating, and it would supposedly suppress your appetite. They made a website that had fantastic claims, implications of Nobel Prize-winning science backing them up, as well as actual and a load of fake credentialed professionals. He had a fake website for the international research organization that allegedly reviewed and certified their product, and emails that would go to the addresses for all the people that were on staff there were redirected back to this, his own staff that would then answer them to make it look like everything was legit. And each one would wear a different persona to make sure that they were responding in a way that made sense for that particular person that they were pretending to be, as well as the person that they were trying to hook. Now, selling a fake product at £10.99 or whatever isn't going to make you tons of money. Instead, what he didn't sell a product. He sold franchises. Cheers, Andrew. He sold those franchises. And in some cases, like for one poor victim, he sold the rights to franchise in New Zealand for $250,000. And what that poor victim got for it was indigestion when they found out that Peter Foster had just absconded with their money. He sold franchises to people all over the world and amassed millions of by doing so. Here, when you're creating something this deep, this robust, you need way more facets. The gem gets way more complex. But at the end of the day, we're talking about focus. However the target's approached, with just a sliver of falsehood or with a work of fiction larger than the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the goal is the same. It's all about moving the target's focus to where the attacker desires. So how do we do that? First, we start with hostages. But you know what? Before I do that, we'll pause. Questions, comments, complaints. How do I feel about open redirects being a threat to phishing or a benefit for phishing? Here's the thing. As students of history will know, a wise individual known as Strongbad once said, you can use your powers for good, or you can use your powers for awesome. And open redirects aren't necessarily good or bad. They're merely a tool. And depending on whether you choose to, let's say you're on the defensive side, if you choose to enable sites that are known to have open redirects, or if you allow certain bits of those features to happen to work inside of your client's browsers, then that's certainly one thing. If instead you're on the attacking side, then finding ways to take advantage of those is something that's of importance to you, because that expands your tool set, expands your ability to be able to conduct the operations that you're trying to do, to be able to expose, if presuming that you're doing an assessment, to expose poor practices that are going on. You can help make the organization that you're working with better. Does that answer it? This is gospel according to data, right? I believe that they open themselves up to prosecution. The problem is that if I'm a crafty attacker, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find an open redirect from a company in country A, and I'm going to use it to hit people in country B, because especially if the company doesn't have much of a presence in country B, then it makes it very difficult to go and get prosecution going, because let's say it's a UK-based company that has the vulnerability, and I don't know, an Australian country or target that I'm going for. Well, I guess they're both Commonwealth. Let's do something else. Let's say India and Pakistan. Company in Pakistan, target in India. The probability of the Indian government going back to Pakistan and being like, hey, bro, you want to fix this for us, is about 0. So me as an attacker, oh man, I'm gonna love me that all day long. But I totally agree with you that there's an onus on that company, if they want to maintain their reputation, that they need to plug those holes, and they need to be looking for those holes, so that way they don't end up like T-Mobile did here in the US, where they're like, oh yeah, millions of our customers just had their information exposed. So sorry about that. Or like how Maresec ended up a couple of years ago when that worm took down their entire network because one person allowed a piece of unknown malicious software onto the network. It's if I'm the attacker and if I'm a legit cyber criminal, then I am absolutely exploiting that all day long. Until someone stops me, I'm doing it. And from a company perspective, if I own that network, it's a question of incentives, right? The question is the incentive for me to do the right thing, is it larger than the investment it will take to find and close those holes? And the answer might be no. The answer might be not at all. It's, it'll cost, I don't know, 200,000 pounds. I'm making numbers up, to find and close what we think are the majority of the holes. Is that actually something that I'm willing to pay? At what point am I going to suffer $200,000 or 200,000 pounds of reputation loss? Wash my hands of it. Not my fault. I did what I was supposed to. I got insurance for that reason. So
Not completely agree with you.
Part of it, I think, is going to be legislation, where if HMG were to say, okay, if you are conducting e-commerce inside of our borders, with anyone inside of our country, the expectation is this: if you want Her Majesty's authority to be able to conduct business inside of our borders, you will be subject to these rules. And if you are found to be complicit in an attack because you allowed this open relay or whatever else to happen, then guess what? you are found partially culpable, and you will be, fined or whatever else, or censured or whatever else, in accordance with this new policy. So until governments, until countries, and until international organizations start taking a harder line with stuff like this, hard to agree with me. We can totally disagree about things. So the goal isn't here to find consensus. The goal is here to explore the area and opinions surrounding. All right, so we were talking about focusing attention on the wrong things, and then we were talking about hostages, right? So let's talk about hostages. So hostages. In the 1970s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation here in the United States, the FBI, was having a rough go of dealing with terrorists taking hostages. They, especially on aircraft. At one point, the FBI was sent in their hostage negotiation team, and they ended up with a lot of dead hostages on an aircraft, which turns out is bad for public relations. And the US government said, you guys suck at this. They got sent back to the drawing board and said, rethink how you do hostage negotiation, because what you're doing is not doing it right. They needed an entirely new way of dealing with these terrorists and hostages. The system they came up with was an entirely new approach on dealing with people in stressful situations, because until then, all negotiation had been based around the idea that everyone in the conversation was perfectly logical. And it turns out that people in stressful situations, people with guns and hostage situations and terrorists and whatnot, turn out to not be all that logical. But you need to be able to you need a way to be able to reach them without having to extract them from the crisis that they're currently in. You need to be able to reach them where they are. And this new approach relied on Daniel Kahneman's seminal work, Thinking Fast and Slow. If you've ever read the book, you'll recognize that he describes two systems that the brain operates under. System one is designed to keep you alive. System one is fast, autonomous, and low resolution. When you see something in the dark, kind of shaped like that, this part of your brain goes, snake! And then after a moment, system two catches up. It's what contains your conscious thought, your logical processing, your analytic capabilities. It's slow and high resolution. This system kicks in and says, no, it's just a stick. Everything's fine. The major discovery here is that system two, the analytic conscious part, gets its input from system one. So therefore, you can influence the inputs that go to system one if you can change system two. Just like that sensor on the B2, you can make very small tweaks and have very large impacts. Wait, what? So how does this help us? On the surface, it might not look like it that it does. So let's sit and think about it for a second. The key here is to attack system one and put the target in a survival situation. Today, most people do not find themselves in survival situations. True, traffic on the M4 can be a bit white-knuckled on occasion, and if you're in the wrong area after a football match in Manchester, things could get a bit exciting. But in reality, most people rarely encounter true survival situations. But nobody told System 1 about this. Anything that is a threat to survival or life or continued existence in the state in which you are currently accustomed can be perceived as a survival situation. Remember, System 1 is very low resolution. It's stupid. So when somebody's sitting at their computer, how do you create a survival situation? What do you guys think? What are some things that you can do to cause them to have a perceived survival situation? What are some other ways you can cause people to feel like they're in a survival situation when their boss emails them and says, "Hey"? What else? Kind of a help me Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're our only hope. Ideally, you don't have to do it in as roundabout a way with a droid and whatnot, but maybe that'll sell it. Cool, good thoughts. What else we got? Yeah, anything that creates a sense of urgency is awesome. Emma says, sending him a text regarding evacuation. Sorry, what we say? Something with a sense of urgency behind it. I think you guys are absolutely right. And what's great and what's terrible about this, depending on your perspective, is that there's really no limit to the number of topics you can use. What I've done is, for me, when I'm doing this or defending against it, there are two things in general that I will use as kind of bins that I put them in. The first, you go for the heart and you go for the wallet. Now, as you guys pointed out, you get bonus points for making it an imminent threat, thus provoking a "I need to do something right now" response. So, for your convenience, I put together a brief list of some neat things that you can do that you can use to either help enhance your defensive gem or your otherwise gem. Everything from charitable causes to religion to funny stuff, sympathy, sport, porn, drugs, risk of exposure for porn or drugs, politics, news, gambling, taxes, bills past due, promotion, demotion, bank compromises, all kinds of things that motivate people to do stuff. Basically, if it's a part of life, you can probably find a way to either exploit it or it's just one more thing you have to defend against. So, like I said, here are a few topics that fit the heart or wallet or both categories. If you're defending, watch for the stuff. It's really hard. It's really, really hard. I know. I get it. Until we've got AI that's actually reliable and is smart enough to be able to identify all of this stuff and to be able to say, "Ooh, that's shady." Until we've got that, it's going to be really tough. And even then, there's no saying that the AI is going to be perfect. A network that I helped defend withstood professional red team attacks better than any other they'd seen in the past. They normally got in after about 3 tries of phishing. It took them about 20 to breach ours, but they still got in. And they did it with a form designed to help somebody with taxes. And of course, tax season was rapidly approaching. And so they felt taxes were a threat. And so they were willing to click. And it was only an email sent to one person. It wasn't mass emailed out to anybody. They got spearphished. And it wasn't even directed specifically to them. I think it was, oh, just, hey, here's a thing. For some people, tax season is a survival situation. Now, this is all, we're talking defensive. If you're assessing a network, this list is a good start. There are lots and lots and lots, infinitely more things that you can use to try and worm your way in. At the end of the day, whatever facet of security you work in, be a gem. Employ multifaceted approaches, baseline your environments and correlate your anomalies. Trust your sensors, but verify their readings. Watch for or create that 0.1% of fiction. Defend in depth, attack in depth. Adjust your facets to the target or the attacker. Make sure that if you're on the defensive side, defeat the phishing using by understanding what the attackers are using from a gem perspective. If you're attacking yourself, create new facets for which there aren't defenses yet. But whatever you do, be a gem.